Hello and welcome back to the Librarian of the Rings. Today we're going to be talking about episode 5 from the Rings of Power, and specifically we're going to talk about one of the things that has been annoying me about the Rings of Power a little bit, and I think it's accentuated by episode 5, and that is the compression of time. Welcome back, my name is Ben, I'm the Librarian. Today let's talk a little bit about episode 5, and specifically we're going to use it as a lens to talk about time compression in the Rings of Power and maybe where the problems are with that in some of the storylines that they are trying to tell. Now, you know that I'm not here to be a hater on the Rings of Power. I've liked the show quite a bit. I liked the first half of season 1 better than the second half of season 1, and I'm a little bit worried that I'm going to like the first half of season 2 better than the second half of season 2 as well. Last week we talked about episode 4, which had a lot of callbacks to the Lord of the Rings in kind of interesting ways. So if you haven't seen that, go ahead and check that out. But episode 5 was completely different than that. There weren't a ton of callbacks to the Lord of the Rings like there was in episode 4, and it seemed to be moving some of the really significant plots of the Rings of Power season 2 forward. Specifically, we saw a lot from Numenor, we also saw a lot of the dwarves, and a lot from Aragian, where Celebrimbor and Sauron have been working on the Rings of Power. The thing that I feel like I'm struggling a lot with here is the time compression. Now, we've always known that there was going to be time compression in the Rings of Power. We saw a lot of time compression in season 1, and I feel like the creators have really been open about their choices that they are going to be compressing time. The story that they're trying to tell in the things that Tolkien did write about the Second Age, of course, are spanning thousands of years. That is how Tolkien's timeline works, because it's dealing with elves, and elves work on a completely different timeline than humans. Because they'll live forever unless they're killed, they don't have the same kind of time constraints that humans do. And that is actually one of the major plot points of the entire Numenor plot, is that elves live forever and humans don't, and humans don't like that. Particularly the Numenorians are a little bit peeved by that. And so that's bound to be a big deal, but in order to help us kind of be able to follow one set of human characters throughout the series, the show creators are really compressing the timeline down, and instead of spanning thousands of years, it might just span a few years. And there's some obvious advantages and disadvantages to doing that. The big advantage is we get to keep the same human characters. They don't have to be dying off every season. The disadvantage is it makes things feel like they are being rushed. And depending on how you wanted to play out the timeline, you could compress thousands of years down into hundreds of years, or thousands of years down into decades, or thousands of years into just a few years. But in episode 5, it's felt like they are compressing a lot of time down into what may just be a few days. And the real difficulty is we don't get very many time markers in this show, or maybe any at all. We don't have a lot of like, this is how many days it's been since the volcano erupted, but they are still feeling aftershocks and effects from the volcano erupting at the end of season 1, so it's not really clear. The only solid timestamp I think we've gotten this season is in the flashback to early Sauron and the orcs with Adar, and it says at the dawn of the Second Age, but we're not really sure how far we are into the Second Age at this point, given the way that they've compressed the timeline. And what's the effect of this? Well, the effect is that we just don't get as much development on some of these plot lines. It seems like things are being rushed. So let's look at the plot lines that we got in episode 5 and how this time compression is kind of affecting them. So first off with Numenor. Numenor we see heading into a really sharp downfall. Numenor is going to be destroyed. It's eventually going to be just wiped out by a giant wave, and that is going to be divine intervention to basically stop Numenor. But in the books, this is a really slow decline. It does pick up, of course, as they approach the bottom of it, but here it seems to be happening really fast. And specifically, we see this happening with some characters. Eärien, who is Elendil's daughter, which the show is made up, but she's not in the books, but we see her kind of as the point of Numenorian decline, along with Pharazôn and his annoying son. It just feels like the pace here is really quick. They've gone from being kind of dissatisfied with their lot in life, maybe they're kind of against the elves, to all of a sudden wanting to destroy shrines and kill innocent people and all kinds of stuff. It seems like there's just a few people that are just turning the whole tide of this very quickly. Whereas in the book, it's a much more slow kind of decline. And I feel like I would have preferred to see this happen more slowly. Now, while we are on the topic of Numenor, let's just point out a couple of things from this episode. One is we see Pharazôn now being in charge after what happened with the eagle. And Miriel appears to be basically shut away and not doing anything. Now, it's interesting because Pharazôn seized power by basically political and propaganda means, and not by marrying Miriel, which is what happens in the books. So I don't know if there is ever going to be a wedding between Pharazôn and Muriel. I don't know if he's ever going to need that political clout now that came with it in the books, because he now appears to be in charge just fine. Although we do know from some behind the scenes stuff that we should still see Muriel have a trial with the sea worm. So don't know how that is all exactly going to play out. Also, I think we got one of the most heartrending moments here in season 5 in Numenor, and that is when Valandil is killed by Pharazôn's stupid son. I think his name is Kemen. Valandil has been a really good character, kind of being brought in as Isildur's friend and this defender of the faithful. And to see him stabbed in the back like that in episode 5 was just a really difficult moment. Now, if this episode was focused on any storyline in particular, it was definitely the dwarves. We get the dwarf rings of power being brought out and issued to Durin, and then he acts like he's going to give them out to the other dwarf lords, but says that it's going to come with a price, which is really interesting. And we see him also using the ring to figure out where they can basically open up the mountain in order to get light coming back into Khazad-dûm. So interesting stuff here, but the pace at which it is happening is really fast. First of all, the dwarf rings seem to have been made incredibly fast. Also, the rate at which he seems to be corrupting. We might call this ring-induced dragon sickness. We know that the rings that went to the dwarves didn't have a lot of effect on them, except basically amplifying their desire to hoard wealth, which was already there for dwarves, but the rings amplified it. And a ring was at the center of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarves. And so we're starting to see that, but the rate at which it's happening is really fast, and the corruption that it seems to be causing in King Durin doesn't seem to be in alignment with what it should be doing. The dwarves should be really resilient. If we should see a slow decline with anyone, it should be the dwarves, if they're going to decline at all and not just start amassing treasure. Certainly the focus is on amassing treasure for Durin. After he's kind of gotten the mountain in order, he just seems to be focused on getting more and more gold, both from his own people and from the other dwarves, and also extracting it from the mountain, which of course is the foreshadowing to lead us to waking up the deep things of the earth and ultimately bringing out the Balrog. And the pace at which this is happening seems to be leading us to a very fast decline of the dwarves, which really shouldn't be happening. I mean, the Balrog shouldn't even appear until the 3rd age, but we basically know that it's going to appear here in the 2nd age, so they are moving that way up. Okay, lastly, let's talk about the elves, and we'll look at the elves who are in Eregion. We see Celebrimbor resisting making more rings, specifically around making rings for Min, which is what Sauron really wants. Sauron seems to know that Min are going to be his best tools here, and he immediately starts out wanting to make rings for Min. The compression of time with the elves I find centered around how long it's taking them to make rings. They made the 3 really quickly, and then they also seem to make the 7 quite quickly. Now we've seen them make what's probably one of the lesser rings, an essay in the craft that turns Celebrimbor's assistant invisible. Now we're going to probably see them very quickly make the 9 rings for Min. Now we know that this needs to be happening quickly because we've been told that the Siege of Eregion, the big battle of this season, is basically going to take place over 3 episodes. Guess how many episodes we have left in the season? That's right, 3. So we should see a lot of battle taking place, and we need the rings to be done. And that's one of the effects of this time compression, is suddenly we need the rings to be done. We don't have a lot of time to really develop them. There aren't a lot of lesser rings being made. There aren't a lot of these prototypes being done. We've seen 1 so far. I don't know how many more we might see. And we just don't have a lot of time for this to be kind of percolating and taking effect. The other thing that we see in this episode is the Dwarves of Durin, which Celebrimbor and Narvi are making. But we haven't had any time for Celebrimbor and Narvi to build a relationship. We've had, I think, a total of 1 scene where they're actually in the same place. And so we don't really have this friendship, which is kind of the whole point of the gate, is to be the friendship gate. We also aren't going to have much time at all. If Eregion starts getting sieged this next episode, we really don't have any time for these doors to ever serve their purpose, to be basically this pathway between Eregion and Moria, this friendship gate. We just don't have any time for that to happen. So that's one of the effects of compressing it. It's basically like we're going to make these doors and then probably never really use them. I don't know. It's hard to say because we haven't seen the last 3 episodes yet, but it does look like they're building it up to being a battle. The orcs are already arriving in order for this to happen. I gotta say, I'm a little bit disappointed with that. I'm a little bit disappointed that we aren't going to get more time to develop these characters and these themes, particularly the subtle corruption of the rings. We already see Durin kind of acting like Bilbo acts in the Lord of the Rings films, and Bilbo at that point had the ring for a long time, whereas Durin's had it maybe a matter of days. It's hard to tell exactly how long, but not too long for sure. And he already seems to be acting very similar to that, already having this corrupting influence. And I would have just loved to get more time to develop the friendship between the elves and the dwarves, because that's a really important point here, is that the elves and the dwarves have friendship, and they kind of like bring that up. Celebrimbor talks about it in this episode, but we haven't really seen it. Besides Elrond and Durin, who already had an existing friendship, we haven't really seen the dwarves and the elves working together. So in summary, I just feel that the pace of episode 5 and probably the whole season up till this point has just been a little bit rushed and a little bit off. Now I know that that might be in response to some people's complaints about season 1, where they felt that it was too slow. I didn't feel that way. I would like to see more time spent on character and theme development, less time just on action sequences. So we'll have to see where it goes from here. I still want to keep an open mind about it. I still am enjoying watching the show, but we will have to see where it goes from here. And now I'd love to hear from you. Go ahead and drop in the comments. Let me know what you think about the pacing of season 2 so far. As always with Rings of Power stuff, it's controversial, and so I will be moderating all of the comments that go up on this video. Until next time, thank you so much for watching. Farewell wherever you fare. May your ears receive you at your journey's end.